Chauvet Cave is probably the oldest cave that we have, where we can see cave art in its original setting. So not only is it one of the oldest cave art in Europe, dating back to some 36,000 years ago, it was sealed around 29,000 years ago by a landslide. And that means that no one has been able, or hardly anyone has been able, to go in there ever since. What this allows us to do, it allows us to look at the art in context. That means we can work out how the cave was laid out, the different functions that different sections of the cave may have had. In most other cave art sites in Europe, this is not that clear. In fact, it is very difficult to work out exactly what certain sections of the cave may have signified, or even in what sequence they may have been visited compared to other sections of the cave. At Chauvet Cave, we don't have that problem. We know where the original entrance area was. We know where people would have entered, which sections they would have entered first, and how they would have progressed through the cave. In that sense, again, Chauvet Cave gives us a very clear idea of what might have happened inside of the cave. It allows us to speculate. Round about the time that the art was created at Chauvet Cave, there may have been two kind of people. Now, we don't know to what degree these people were really different. We have to assume that both of these people were our ancestors to some degree, but one type of people was very robust. We normally refer to these people as the Neanderthal people, although it would be fairer to say the people of the Neanderthal culture, because clearly they belonged to a culture that had adapted to life during an ice age. The other people were a lot more slender. But not only were they a lot more slender, they were also more organized. We know that they had workshops, that from then on people started to have greater social hierarchies. How do we know people had greater social hierarchies? Well, we know this because we are finding graves that date round about to that time, where there were grave gifts put with the dead that require such a huge amount of working hours that one person would not have been able to create that for themselves. What is that saying? What that is saying is that they were part of a community who in one way or another invested in them, heavily invested in them. Now we know that during the time of the Neanderthal culture, people also heavily invested in each other. But we don't find this sort of ornaments and gifts given to the dead. What we do find is that people were looked after. So we know there were individuals that had severe disabilities that managed to live to quite an old age for people of the Neanderthal culture. And they could only do that by being looked after. What we find in the Aurignacian culture, which is the first culture of these slender people, is that people started to have a lot more body ornamentation, religion or religious activities becoming far more organized and complex. Very often we think of cave art just as people going into caves and doodling around a little bit. Well, that's not really what happened. The caves are structured. Even when we look at Chauvet Cave, which is 36,000 years old, we can clearly see that different conventions, different colors were used in different sections of the cave. And we must assume that access to different aspects and different parts of the cave was strongly regulated. More and more we're coming to realize that cave art is really, or was really, ritual art. To what degree it was organized as a religion and what that would even mean, that is a broad debate. But people didn't just go into caves and doodled onto the walls. In many cases, we know that people had to put up scaffolding to put an image in a certain place. So it is very similar to people decorating temples or churches and putting up scaffolding because they decide it would be really significant or relevant to have a picture there. And they think about the kind of picture they want to have there. They don't just sort of like, we don't go into a church and say, oh yeah, wow, just going to go up there and doodle something. No. The point is, everything had some kind of symbolic significance. And we find a lot of symbolism in the caves. And particularly at Chauvet Cave, we can see this symbolism going through. And there's one panel in particular called the panel of signs. I prefer to call it the panel of red signs. And on this panel, we see very abstract symbols. Current convention has it that it is not possible to decipher what these symbols show. And the explanations that have been put forward is that perhaps they show insects, maybe a butterfly, maybe a scorpion of some kind. Now the sign of which it is said that it might be a butterfly actually doesn't have the 4 wing sections of a butterfly. So only if someone took a very childish approach to painting a butterfly would this comparison with the butterfly, with this lobed sign, be appropriate. The same is true of the other sign, which is referred to often as the barbed sign. Now the barbed sign has got 12 extremities. There's 6 lines on a horizontal plane, so it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then there's a 7th line that cuts through it. So there are 12 points, and if you want something is slipping out at the bottom, and that would be the 13th extremity. Anyone who deals with shamanism, anyone who deals with mythology will prick up their ears. They'll go, what? 12 extremities one way, and then there's a 13th one going down? Right. This is the theme of 12 and 1. Now this is repeated throughout ancient mythology and ancient religious systems and pagan systems. The reason for that is because you fit 12 full lunar cycles within a solar year and a 13th, but only a bit. So the 13th lunar cycle accompanies one solar year into the next, and therefore it is hugely significant. Now the other thing that is really interesting is that the barbed sign appears once, but Jean-Claude, who is probably the most eminent archaeologist in France and perhaps of our time, he's one of the most published archaeologists and anthropologists of our era. He was in charge of the excavation of Chauvet Cave for a long, long time, and he pointed out that on this panel you can see about 7 of these lobed signs surrounding this barbed sign. And what is interesting is that there are 7 dashes or single lines, simple lines that are just made with one finger like this. And these lines are in different position but associated with this lobe sign. Now the number 7 goes right through antiquity. The ancient Egyptians already counted 7 days. In the bear cult, now the bear cult was a shamanic religious system that was practiced throughout the entire northern hemisphere. And it's probably very, very ancient. it was practiced in North America as well by the Native American Indians there. And we must assume that the bear cult was therefore already practiced before they arrived in North America. And that the bear cult predated this migration, which happened round about 18,000 years ago. In the bear cult, it is imagined that somewhere in the heavens, around the star constellation of the Big Bear and the Small Bear, Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, which are all made up of 7 stars each, the bear was residing like the ancestral guardian of humanity. In the bear cult, the bear is favored by nature. The bear has shamanic qualities of transgressing between the heavens and the underworld. And it is this transgression between the heavens and the underworld, the primordial seas mixing, that was thought to create the middle world, the world that we live in. And actually, that's not such a silly thought at all. In many ways, that's probably true. You know, we are this interplay between what is above us and what is below us. You know, we know from biology that most of life is not on land, it's actually in the earth. We are walking on a living planet that is filled with bacterial life forms and microbial life forms. So the bear cult stretched throughout the northern hemisphere, and in the bear cult the most important number is the number 7, because it relates to the constellation of the star system, the stars that circle the polar star. And because Ursa Major and Ursa Minor are next to the polar star, what happens is that throughout the solar year, they never dip below the horizon. And we must remind ourselves that dipping below the horizon meant dipping into the underworld. So the bear was up there. And that's why that constellation was seen as the archetypical space in the sky, where all the ancestral spirit energy came from. So when we look at the panel of red signs, it must strike us that there are possible number references that relate to this aspect of the bear cult. When we look at the art at Chauvet Cave, we can tell for various reasons that the bear had a very central function in the cave, both through images and through skulls and remains of the bear that are the most plentiful throughout the cave. And there's a skull in particular which is placed on a rock, which suggests that perhaps this particular skull was revered. And there's other indications that a lot of the bones originally were stacked up and arranged in a certain way. So Chauvet Cave is almost a classic bear cult site. To make all of this a bit more interesting, there's also an indication that the people of the Neanderthal culture revered the bear in one form or another. There are huge debates around this. Normally these debates are based on arguments which say, well, how do we know that this association between these bear bones here and these human fossils, Neanderthal fossils there, were really linked and not just accidental? How do we know this is not just erosion? These are fair arguments, they need to be considered. However, a lot of sites dating to the Neanderthal era, so before 40,000 years to maybe 120, 200,000 years ago, in this entire period, time and again, we find some kind of association between Neanderthal people and the bear to the point where bare bones are deposited in stone caches. So there's a space that was lined by stone slabs filled with bare bones, and then there's another space next to it, and in there was the skeleton of a Neanderthal male. That feels very much like human sacrifice and spiritual and ritual activity, but really we're digressing too far. But what Chauvet gives us, it gives us a tantalizing thought that some of what we see here may be related to indigenous culture, to Neanderthal culture that went before. And we do know that to some extent, even today, we can trace Neanderthal genes in all people that did not originate from sub-Saharan Africa. That is all the people in Europe and Asia, Polynesia and so on. There are certain percentages linked to that. I personally think they're very dubious. I think it's very difficult to put such percentages on any human group. That is a different topic, which I hope to sort of cover at some point. But clearly, we know that there was a link between people of the Neanderthal culture and the people that followed. And because there was a genetic link, it is reasonable to assume that there was a cultural link as well. In fact, there are some people who think that even the people of the Neanderthal culture may have triggered or significantly contributed to this origination culture, this technological and cultural revolution that followed. And it may well be that the reason why people became so slender and lost this robustness is because they became so much more technologically advanced that this technology and the culture of living in bigger groups buffered them against the strains of living in a natural ice age environment. When we look at the fossil record, we do find instances where people of the Neanderthal culture show the cultural adaptation of the origination culture. And the earliest cave art in Europe at the moment that we know of is in the Chauvet Cave in northern Spain. It is 40,000 years old. And at that time we have not a single fossil yet of a human being with our modern, slender, as it were, physiology. So the people that we can find at that time, that date to that time, to 40,000 years ago, they're people with a Neanderthal morphology. So there's a big question, there's a big debate going on, which is not always represented in the media, where some scientists very much believe that there was a continuation and that somehow we don't understand the evolutionary mechanisms properly that dictate what we look like. And if anyone were to look at the fossil record after the Industrial Revolution, what they might think is that, wow, these big people and much meeker people, because we're not as strong as even our grandfather's generation, because we don't live such a physical lifestyle, and we have the deformities to show for it. People might look at the fossil record and say, oh look, round about that time, there's a very sudden shift where people, 1 minute they look fairly robust but small, and they don't live so well. Their houses aren't that developed, and all of a sudden you get this technological advance where people have computers and technology and electricity and build these skyscrapers. And when we look at them, they're taller and they're more slender. Now this could lead us to think that what happened was these original people, these small people, they were living there, and then all of a sudden they were invaded by this technologically advanced new culture. with these tall people. But in fact, what really happened was that technology and culture changed, and that people changed with it.